Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment, Part 2 of our look at our 33rd Vice President of the United States, HenryAWallace. HenryAWallace, I hope you enjoyed yesterday's Part 1, taking a look at the early life and the political rise of HenryAWallace. Of course, grew up, born in Iowa, a farm boy through and through. Definitely big on the subject of corn.
Chicken the corn, on the corn can't grow, mama. When chicken the corn, so the corn can't grow. When chicken the corn, so the corn can't, mama. When chicken the corn, so the corn can't grow.
As we learned yesterday, we'll learn more about today. And then, of course, he was Secretary of Agriculture, and all this interesting stuff and all these things that we learned yesterday regarding HenryAWallace. So, here we go. Part 2 today. We're going to take a look at his vice presidency, his legacy, and then, of course, his death and gravesite, like we do here at Dead History. So, flying solo for the audio, so let's just jump right in and get into Part 2 of our 33rd Vice President of the United States, HenryAWallace. Here we go. The 1940 election. The Republicans in 1940 had chosen a dynamic dark horse candidate for president, Wendell Willkie, and to balance the ticket, the convention had selected the Republican Senate Minority Leader, Charles McNary of Oregon. During the 1920s, McNary had chaired the Senate Agriculture Committee and had won national attention, particularly in agricultural areas, for his sponsorship of the McNary-Haugen bills. Vetoed by Presidents Coolidge and Hoover, these bills were forerunners of the New Deal's agricultural program. Seeking to neutralize McNary's popularity in the Farm Belt, FDR decided to make his Secretary of Agriculture his vice president. Roosevelt also felt confident that, if anything happened to him, Wallace would vigorously pursue the liberal objectives of the New Deal. Democratic convention delegates were furious, however, since they considered the former Republican Wallace as an outsider, lacking any of the qualities of a typical politician. When warned that the delegates might revolt, Roosevelt made it clear that they will go for Wallace or I won't run, and you can jolly well tell them so. Party leaders reluctantly capitulated to the president's demand and nominated Wallace, but the convention's mood was so sour that Wallace decided not to make an acceptance speech. Shortly after Wallace became the vice presidential candidate, stories circulated about his religious beliefs. Having abandoned the Calvinism of his youth, he had studied Catholicism. Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and Christian Science, finally settling into the Episcopal Church in Washington. It's actually Zoroastrianism. I've never heard of that, ever. So I apologize that I butchered that. But it's actually one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, having originated in ancient Persia. So No idea. Never heard of it. I apologize to anyone out there that may practice that religion. I just have never heard of it. Continuing on, but Wallace had also fallen under the influence of a Russian-born guru named Nicholas Roerich. During the 1930s, Wallace had written a series of letters to one of Roerich's associates detailing his spiritual beliefs and his candid observations about contemporary political leaders. These so-called guru letters fell into the hands of Republicans who considered releasing them to embarrass Wallace during the campaign. Democrats countered with evidence that presidential candidate Willkie had carried on an extramarital affair. Although the two parties eventually agreed to a quid pro quo that suppressed both the guru letters and the Willkie affair, the news shook some of Roosevelt's confidence in his running mate. Nonetheless, the Democratic team swept the election. And as I always like to do, I like to take a look at the election that got our subject, the vice president, elected to the vice presidency. And that would be, of course, like we just touched on, the 1940 United States election. It was the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt going up against the Republican Wendell Willkie. And this was Roosevelt's third term. So he was going for an unprecedented third term in office. And I actually have found somebody that's going to help us, a special guest with the 1940 election. Oh, I found yet another Henry to help us out. We have 3 HenryAWallaces that we learned about. Uncle Henry Wallace, Henry, what's his dad's name? I'm drawing a blank here now. Henry, the other Henry, the third Henry, no, the fourth Henry. His father was Henry Cantwell Wallace, and then our vice president is HenryAWallace, and now you're HenryAWallace. Hey, Henry.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good. So I got Henry here, another Henry to help us out. So Henry, was this election even close?
No.
Come here, come closer.
No.
Not even close, right?
Not even close.
So let's say, for Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, how many electoral votes did they get?
449 for Franklin D. Roosevelt and 82.
82 for Wendell Willkie.
Wendell Willkie.
Wow, 449 to 82. And how many states did Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace carry? How many?
38.
And Willkie carried?
10.
Wow, that's big. Now, popular vote, it was 54.7% to Roosevelt and Wallace. I mean, basically, this was a slaughtering, wasn't it, Henry?
Yeah.
I mean, this was a big time, butt whooping by FDR and Henry Wallace. So they ran away with this election. Landslide. Of course, you're seeing maps. You might be seeing some other posters and that sort of thing. But there you go. That's the 1940 election that got Franklin Roosevelt. I should say he was actually reelected for a third term, an unprecedented third term. And then, of course, Henry Wallace became vice president. So pretty interesting stuff. So, Henry, I'm going to ask you if you could take a guess. We talked in part 1 about Henry Wallace was really, really big into one food item. It was actually a vegetable. Can you take a guess at what that food item, vegetable, would be? You've eaten it.
Eggplant.
No, not eggplant.
Zucchini.
Not zucchini.
Cucumber.
Not cucumber.
Carrots.
Carrots, you're getting closer. It's a C word.
C word. Celery.
Celery. No, jeez. You went all out there. Think about sometimes you can eat this popped.
Popped.
Pop. You get it at the movies. Popcorn.
So
what is it?
Popcorn.
Oh, corn!
Oh.
Not popcorn. Corn!
Corn.
All right. Well, Henry, thanks for stopping by and giving us a little guest appearance.
You're welcome.
And hopefully maybe you'll stop by later.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. See you
Welcome.
later, Henry.
Bye.
Wallace's ascension to the vice presidency was also characterized by controversy. Roosevelt, running for an unprecedented third term, chose Wallace to run with him in 1940, both for the latter's demonstrated administrative abilities and as a counterbalance to the concessions Roosevelt had made to conservatives in the Democratic Party during his first two terms. At the Democratic Convention that summer, Roosevelt was insistent, explicitly threatening to decline the presidential nomination if the Democrats rejected Wallace as his running mate. In this context, the convention experience was humiliating for Wallace. Delegates who resented Roosevelt's dictatorial behavior, as well as those who were specifically opposed to Wallace, focused their anger on Wallace, who was shocked by the crowd's vehemence. Ilo Wallace was driven to tears by the antagonism aimed at her husband. Wallace eventually won the nomination in a close vote over House Speaker William Bankhead of Alabama, but was unable to deliver his acceptance speech to the convention due to the delegates' hostility. He gave it the following month instead at a campaign kickoff in Des Moines, Iowa. Wallace took on something like an enforcer's role in the campaign of 1940, frequently attacking the Republicans in the realm of foreign affairs. Most pointedly, he tried to taint them with the stain of Nazism, arguing that FDR's efforts in global affairs were impeded internationally by Hitler and domestically by partisan opponents. He developed an image of a proto-fascism nascent in the United States arising out of isolationism and monopolistic corporate capitalism, both of which he associated with the Republican Party. Wallace's quite vicious attacks drew a great deal of criticism not only from the Republicans, but also from less partisan sources, including the moderate press. His rhetorical strategy was attacked for being unjust and even irresponsible in its exaggeration. Indeed, it is clear that Wallace did go too far in some of the aspirations he cast on the Republicans in 1940, but he did so out of his real belief that the United States had to move quickly to prepare for an inevitable war, and that any group that hindered that preparation was, in effect, appeasing the fascists. In the wake of the Munich crisis of 1938 and the advent of the ideological powerful Munich analog, Wallace's view was not in any sense an extraordinary one for a liberal in the United States to hold by 1940.
Wartime Vice President.
Some chapter introduction by Henry. There we go. When he first took office, Wallace found the job of vice president untaxing. During the early months of his tenure, he had more time for tennis than ever before. But as the United States moved closer to war, the vice president began to assume unprecedented duties, being assigned executive tasks to allow Roosevelt more freedom to deal with international affairs. One of Wallace's biographers, Richard Walton, has asserted that never before nor since has a vice president had so much direct executive authority. Others referred to him as the first working vice president. Named a member of FDR's secret war cabinet, Wallace chaired the Economic Defense Board, the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board, and the Board of Economic Warfare. Journalists began to refer to him as Mr. Assistant President. So there you go, Henry. He was, at first, he was playing a lot of tennis. You like to play tennis,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah? What are you, pretty good or you stink?
I think.
Well, that was candid. At least you're honest about it. You're not too good at tennis, huh?
No.
That's all right. It's not for everybody, right? There you go.
Everyone has their own sport.
That's right. Everyone has their own sport. That's true. All right, here we go. Moving on. Divided into an Office of Imports, Office of Exports, and Office of War Analysis, the Board of Economic Warfare, BEW, supported the Allied war effort through procurement of strategic resources. As chairman, Wallace freed himself to deal with long-term policy matters by delegating the day-to-day management of the BEW to Milo Perkins, an associate from the Agriculture Department. Like many special boards created by President Roosevelt, the BEW came in for its share of interdepartmental bickering, rivalries, and conflicts of authority. Although Roosevelt expressly forbade federal government agencies to publicly criticize each other during the war, Wallace, after 8 years of fighting within the cabinet, failed to recognize that the president was serious about this order. Wallace's diary traces his fight to gain greater autonomy for the BEW and his many clashes with cabinet officers like Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Secretary of Commerce Jesse Jones. These established bureaucrats did not relish the thought of an activist vice president assuming responsibilities that their departments normally held. Wallace believed that the wartime emergency required drastic action to deal with problems like rubber shortages, while Jones and Hull believed that existing mechanisms could solve even wartime demands. Wallace's assertion of his authority to purchase material vital to the war effort spawned conspicuous political battles. When Roosevelt signed an executive order in April of 1942 allowing the BEW to negotiate contracts with foreign governments, Secretary Hull saw it as an attempt to create a second Department of State. Wallace's goal for social justice ran against the grain of Hull's State Department policies. For instance, Wallace was firmly convinced that the Latin American rubber supply could be increased dramatically if the living standards of that region's rubber workers were raised to reduce the incidence of chronic malnutrition and malaria. He attempted to force negotiated contracts to provide for socially beneficial improvements to the Latin American infrastructure, with the United States funding half the cost of these programs. Wallace's acquisition of executive authority had been unpopular with the rank and file in Congress, and most members supported Hull, a former senator, in his attacks on the BEW and its chairman. A growing consensus that Wallace had pushed a too active program in Latin America caused Roosevelt to issue another executive order which preserved the State Department's monopoly on negotiations with foreign governments, a blow aimed directly at Wallace's authority. The BEW controversy climaxed in February of 1943, when Wallace tried to place the purchasing authority of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, under the BEW's jurisdiction. An infuriated Commerce Secretary Jesse Jones roundly denounced what he considered Wallace's arrogant action. When Wallace retaliated by accusing Jones of delaying shipments of quinine to Marines dying of malaria, the imbroglio became too hot for Roosevelt to ignore. The embattled vice president wrote to the president asking for either complete vindication for his actions in the matter or relief of his duties as chairman of the BEW. Roosevelt responded on July 15th of 1943 by dissolving the BEW and reconstituting its function under a new Foreign Economic Administration headed by Leo Crowley, a known supporter of Jones. By revealing the strained relations between the president and vice president, the order substantially weakened Wallace's position in Washington politics. Until then, Wallace had been the ideal and inspiration of every little word planner in Washington, wrote the commentator Raymond Moley. After Roosevelt abolished the BEW, it was clear to them that they must forsake their high priest and follow the president. Wallace undertook his first vice presidential task prior to actually taking office. A few weeks after the election, Roosevelt appointed the vice president-elect to head a U.S. delegation to the December 1st inauguration of Manuel Avila Camacho as President of Mexico. It was an assignment that gave Wallace an opportunity to work to bring about the realization of his longtime hope for hemispheric cooperation, a goal he had advocated since entering government. Wallace was an excellent choice for the mission. As his interest in Latin America had blossomed over the years, he had become an ardent student of Latin American culture as well as of the Spanish language. By the time he left for Mexico, he was fully conversational in Spanish, which greatly impressed the Mexicans. His penchant for visiting with the common people, as well as his ability to communicate in their native tongue, drew enthusiastic responses wherever he traveled. While in Mexico, Wallace conducted an extensive correspondence with Washington in which he advocated an amicable settlement of several issues of contention between the United States and Mexico, most connected to the reformist policies of the outgoing president, Lázaro Cárdenas. It was Cárdenas's administration that had expropriated foreign, including U.S. oil companies' holdings in Mexico in 1938, causing an international dispute that had seriously threatened the viability of Roosevelt's good neighbor policy throughout Latin America. Wallace contended that the new Mexican regime was likely to be amenable to reaching some sort of final settlement of the oil issue. Doing so would in turn open the door to further Mexican-U.S. cooperation, and Wallace hoped that such cooperation would take a course close to his own heart. He believed that the United States could greatly help the Mexicans by, among other things, setting up an agricultural experiment station in Mexico. As a farm leader and now former Secretary of Agriculture, he knew how helpful such stations had been to U.S. farmers over the years. Wallace felt that if the United States established such an agency in Mexico, it might have a similarly beneficial impact on Mexican agriculture, and so ultimately improve the lives of thousands of impoverished Mexicans. After the inauguration, Wallace had little difficulty taking up the formal tasks of the vice president. He proved himself fully capable of presiding over the Senate, both in terms of mastering procedure and acquainting himself with its members. By nature, Wallace had little interest in the convoluted political machinations of the senators. He did, however, attempt to raise their health consciousness by getting rid of his predecessor's infamous liquor cabinet. Wallace was for the most part a teetotaler, and presenting himself as a physical fitness role model through his constant participation in sports ranging from boxing to tennis. He also maintained the wide range of intellectual interests that he had pursued since his youth. His office was known for its extensive and varied collection of reading material. In addition, as vice president, Wallace continued to nurture U.S. cooperation with Latin America by keeping up his Spanish language studies, supporting a national radio program that popularized Latin American culture in the United States, and advocating various educational and cultural exchange programs between the United States and the other nations of the Western Hemisphere. In July of 1941, Wallace was given a task that established a new administrative aspect for the office of Vice President. Roosevelt appointed him to head the Economic Defense Board, the EDB, made up of 8 members of the cabinet. The agency was renamed the Board of Economic Warfare, the BEW, after Pearl Harbor, and Wallace remained as its wartime director. The BEW's primary responsibility was locating and obtaining items of strategic importance to the United States from all over the globe. In supervising these operations, Wallace came into direct and highly visible bureaucratic conflict with Secretary of Commerce Jesse Jones, a conservative Texas Democrat who was also director of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, as well as, ultimately, federal loan disbursement in general. The main circumstance behind the controversy was that the RFC was the BEW's banker, which meant that disagreements over procurement, whether philosophical or in regard to specific goals, were likely to lead to classic bureaucratic battles. For Wallace, there were 2 interconnected concerns that together formed the crux of the conflict: efficient material procurement and the assumption that procurement policies had to be socially just, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also to attain optimum efficiency. The problem was that Wallace and his subordinates at the BEW believed that the simple fact of being at war meant that peacetime assumptions regarding the flow of goods were to be disregarded. The exigencies of war demanded innovation and particularly might mean foregoing what would normally be considered sober business practices. For Wallace's BEW, the profit motive was not a driving strategic principle, but for millionaire businessman Jones and his like-minded team, following sound business practices was of paramount importance. The intertwining of Wallace's concern for procurement efficiency with his liberal humanitarianism was evident in his regard for the well-being of the workers in other nations who were producing the supplies the BEW sought to procure, especially in Wallace's much-beloved Latin America. To Wallace, the working conditions and health of those he had come to term collectively the common man were bound to the question of efficiency. Healthy workers would produce more and do so more efficiently, benefiting the United States both during and after the war. What was humane actually made the best business sense. By spring of 1943, the conflict between Wallace and Jones ranged over various procurement issues. It had also become acrimonious and public, the latter quality being one that Roosevelt ultimately would not tolerate. Jones had used a Senate Banking and Currency Committee hearing the year before to attack the BEW's rubber procurement policy. Wallace and his assistant Milo Perkins, given an opportunity to respond, implied that Jones and the RFC, through their obstructionism, had failed to protect the nation's strategic interests in numerous instances. The whole exchange appeared in newspapers across the country. In June of 1943, the BEW was attacked in an inflammatory manner on the Senate floor by Jones's allies. This, along with similar concurrent attacks in the House, led Wallace and Perkins to issue a lengthy press release detailing the impediments created by Jones and the RFC in the creation of adequate stockpiles of a whole list of strategic materials. This statement included the assertion that by obstructing BEW efforts at obtaining supplies of quinine for U.S. troops in the Pacific Theater, the RFC had actually caused the deaths of U.S. servicemen. Jones responded with public outrage, insisting that Wallace, in effect, had called him a traitor. Roosevelt intervened, and at first indirectly, having Wallace and Jones meet under mediation to attempt a reconciliation. They agreed to a public statement, but Jones decided after the fact to issue a statement of his own that once more attacked in vehement language Wallace's criticism of the RFC. Then on July 5th, he issued his own press release in response to Wallace's and Perkins' of the previous month. The obvious failure of reconciliation over the next week impelled Roosevelt to direct action. On July 15th, he abolished the BEW altogether by executive order, thus ending the conflict. While the RFC did lose some of its authority over foreign contracts, the president's action clearly was a defeat for Wallace, and the episode contributed to the mounting desire of conservative Democrats to force him from the vice presidency the following year. At the time, however, Wallace accepted his defeat with equanimity. Wallace's poise in the face of public defeat may have derived in part from the fact that by the time of the BEW's liquidation in the summer of 1943, he had firmly established himself not only as the United States' leading progressive liberal, but also as the nation's great champion of cooperative internationalism. He had done so in May of 1942 when he gave what was the best known and perhaps most important speech of his career, formerly titled The Price of Free World Victory. This speech, widely published and republished over subsequent weeks and months, became known by its most poignant phrase, the century of the common man. Take a listen.
Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, the century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. There must be neither military nor economic imperialism. The march of freedom of the past 150 years has been a great revolution of the people. There were the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, the Russian Revolution. Each spoke for the common man. Some went to excess, but people groped their way to the light.
It was an address that not only articulated Wallace's liberal internationalism as it had evolved through the 1920s and 1930s, but also laid out his vision for post-war global affairs as well. He attacked U.S. tariff policy as he had in the 1920s for the manner in which it had contributed to international economic upheaval, and he spoke to the historical and moral context of the war, characterizing it dramatically as a fight to the death between the free world and the slave world. Wallace once more attacked fascism abroad and industrial monopoly at home as the great threats to both the international and domestic democracy. He declared that modern technological knowledge could overcome inequities in the world and create the shared abundance he had long championed. At the same time, he was demanding, as director of the BEW, foreign procurement contracts that protected the health and well-being of the workers of other nations. Wallace asserted in Century of the Common Man that modern technological know-how made such a demand wholly responsible. Wallace insisted that by 1942 modern technology was capable of ensuring that everybody in the world has the privilege of drinking a quart of milk a day. The statement was not an offer to use national wealth without restraint to support the world's poor, as it was often and sometimes deliberately misconstrued. Rather, Wallace was arguing that the knowledge existed to enable the citizens of all nations to attain the means to supply themselves with the necessities of life. His use of the dietary metaphor arose from his belief that children who ate well would learn well enough to master the technology that would industrialize their nations, enabling those nations to participate in the cooperative post-war global prosperity that Wallace envisioned. With such hopes in mind, Wallace declared that this war against fascism could be viewed as one more, perhaps culminating step in a great revolution of the people that began with the American Revolution and continued with the French, Latin American, German, and Russian revolutions. As Senate President. In spite of his earlier success as Agricultural Secretary, Wallace demonstrated acute political insensitivity in his failure at BEW. I did not look on myself as very much of a politician, he said, revealingly. Wallace disliked the formalities and superficialities of the political world, particularly as practiced on Capitol Hill, and he lacked the small talk abilities critical in a system so dependent on unofficial meetings and social politics. Senate staff member Richard Riedel judged Wallace the least congressional of all the vice presidents and recorded that he possessed none of the political talents that enable public figures to mingle with and influence each other. Wallace never fit into the Senate's club-like atmosphere, in part because he refused to join the club. One of his first acts as president of the Senate was to close down the private bar that Cactus Jack Garner had maintained to entertain senators in his office. Wallace himself neither drank nor smoked. Later, when Wallace hit a home run during a congressional baseball game, a senator observed that it clearly furnished more pleasure for him than any political contest. The Spartan, health-conscious Wallace chose to demonstrate his physical prowess over the men who held him at a political arm's length. During a friendly boxing match, he knocked out Louisiana Senator Allen Ellender, who had been less than supportive of Wallace's vice presidency. As the Senate's presiding officer, Wallace found his duties monotonous and boring. He disdained the senator's right of unlimited debate and slumped down unceremoniously in the presiding officer's chair during the proceedings. When he tried to intervene in debate, the senator slapped him down. Wallace once suffered an embarrassing browbeating from Tennessee's crusty Kenneth McKellar, who had been arguing over the rules of the Senate for several hours. When Wallace from the chair declared this tirade a parliamentary trick, McKellar launched into an attack on the presiding officer and ultimately forced Wallace to apologize for his impetuous insult. Left only with his constitutional role of breaking tie votes, Wallace was able to cast only 4 votes, the most satisfying being to prevent the Senate from terminating the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I apologize, guys, if my voice sounds a little weird or my pronunciation is even more off than usual. I think I actually have like a chipped tooth in the back of my mouth. So the sharpness of the tooth is rubbing and I guess like kind of irritating my tongue toward the back. And I think it's actually made my tongue kind of swollen in that area. So it kind of like sounds like I'm like talking like this a little, like or something like that, where it sounds like I have like a fat lip or something, but that's what's happening. So I apologize if it sounds a little off. Moving on, here we go. A roving vice president. It soon became clear that Wallace's aspirations lay beyond the Senate chamber. More interested in the issues of the world, he became the first vice president to take an active role in foreign policy, serving as the president's personal ambassador. Wallace made his first trip in late 1940 when Roosevelt sent him to an inauguration of Mexican President Camacho, whose disputed election threatened Mexican political stability and U.S. access to Mexican trade. Having studied the language, Wallace eagerly delivered a speech in Spanish to the crowd gathered at the Mexican capital, an effort that won him thunderous applause. In 1943, Wallace made an official tour of Costa Rica, Panama, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. At every stop, he took pains to meet the common people and converse with them in their native tongue. He traveled without a large entourage and refused to accept costly ceremonial gifts. The images of bitter suffering and poverty that he encountered in these underdeveloped countries convinced Wallace of the need for U.S. humanitarian aid and strengthened his resolve to struggle for a lasting post-war peace. In 1944, the president asked Wallace to make an even more ambitious and dangerous trip to China and the Soviet Union. Historians continue to speculate on whether Roosevelt expected Wallace to accomplish anything diplomatically or simply wanted the vice president out of the country while preparing to dump him from the Democratic ticket. Whatever was at stake, Wallace felt exuberant and optimistic about the possibilities of his venture. FDR asked him to foster greater cooperation between Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces in China, and to prod the nationalists into stepping up their campaign against the Japanese. Arriving in Siberia, Wallace tried again to meet the indigenous population as he had in Latin America. Even though he spoke little Russian and had to use an interpreter, he insisted on delivering an address in Russian at Irkutsk. I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. I apologize. He visited the collective farms in several Siberian villages and seemed most impressed with their productivity. These observations planted the seeds of Wallace's respectful impression of the Soviet Union. Later analysis revealed that his visit had been considerably more orchestrated by the Soviets than Wallace or the rest of his party had realized. Wallace saw the famous Soviet Academy of Science but not the advanced atomic experiments being conducted there. Similarly, he was never taken to visit the nearby forced labor camps and consequently gained a distorted view of Soviet life. After touring Russia, Wallace's modest entourage of diplomats arrived in Chongqing to begin their most difficult and least successful task, trying to solve China's major wartime problems. Unprepared for the sad state of Chiang Kai-shek's regime, Wallace concluded that cooperation between the nationalists and communists would be nearly impossible. Nevertheless, he managed to negotiate an agreement by which U.S. forces were to enter northern China to set up weather stations to aid in bombing raids against the Japanese. Although the publicity from Wallace's first two goodwill tours had been highly positive and had helped him to redefine the vice president's role in foreign relations, his final journey gravely damaged his political career. Wallace's favorable view of the Soviet Union became increasingly pronounced and more widely discussed. Shortly before his marathon tour of Russia and China, Wallace wrote an article for the New York Times called "The Dangers of American Fascism," in which he condemned the rising tide of anti-Soviet propaganda. Seeking to break down the wall of ignorance between the Russian and American cultures, he anticipated that the two peoples would eventually find they shared the same hopes and fears and can live together in friendship. His visit to Russia and the warm welcome he received there further softened his views. Wallace compared the Soviet citizens he visited in Siberia with the farm families of the Midwest whom he had known as a boy. His warm regard for the Soviet Union earned him a liberal identity during the war and a heretical image during the Cold War that followed. Wallace's idealism. Wallace envisioned a post-war era governed by an international peacekeeping force and an international court, rather than through balance of power politics. His plan also called for an end to European imperialism in Asia and Africa. In an address to the Free World Association on May 8th of 1942, Wallace outlined his Century of the Common Man, in which he endorsed federal support for education and collective health care for workers. These proposals would have required continuing the initiatives of the New Deal era that Wallace so admired, but the administration lacked sufficient political capital to promote an expanded program of domestic social welfare because of the enhanced executive war powers adopted by the president. More than the New Deal inspired HenryAWallace, Christian morality and the social gospel formed the fundamental inspiration behind his speeches. As a product of Protestant liberalism, he adhered to the principles of the Sermon on the Mount and saw himself as bound to accomplish the work of the Lord. President Roosevelt admired and sought to harness his vice president's idealistic liberalism, while at the same time trying to teach him how the political machinery of Washington really operated. Roosevelt thought that Wallace was a few years ahead of his time and expected that his ideas would eventually be realized. Yet Wallace's inability to grasp Washington politics led to a marked decline in the vice president's stature on Capitol Hill in the final year of his tenure. Growing hostility between the executive branch and the conservatively oriented Congress finally convinced FDR that Wallace had become an expensive political liability. The 1944 election. As the 1944 elections approached, 4 influential Democrats decided to ensure that Wallace was not nominated in the next Democratic convention. Terming themselves the Conspiracy of the Pure in Heart, the 4 consisted of Democratic Party Chairman Robert Hannigan, Postmaster General Frank Walker, New York Democratic Party Chief Ed Flynn, and Democratic Party Treasurer Edwin Pauley. The Democratic leadership had unsuccessfully opposed Wallace in the 1940 nomination convention, but this time they had the advantage of Roosevelt's declining health and his increasing preoccupation with wartime diplomacy. Roosevelt himself appears to have grown dissatisfied with the vice president's record. Wallace had not proved himself to be the political partner Roosevelt had hoped he would become. The president's motivation in sending Wallace overseas at a critical political time at home may therefore have been devious. The Asian journey allowed Wallace no time to campaign and made him vulnerable to political attack. When Wallace returned to Washington's National Airport, he faced reporters who asked if he planned to withdraw from the race. The vice president replied, "I am seeing the president at 4:30. I have a report to make on a mission to China. I do not want to talk politics." But Wallace did try to make a compelling case that he should continue as FDR's running mate, indicating that he had the support of labor leaders and rank-and-file Democrats. In that conversation on July 11th, Roosevelt appeared sympathetic to keeping Wallace on the team. Wallace asked the president to communicate his support in writing to the Democratic leadership, assuming that the endorsement of the terribly popular chief executive would resolve the matter as it had 4 years earlier. Roosevelt's letter, however, emphasized that he had no desire to dictate to the convention. This approach left the door open to the conspiracy of the pure in heart to find a replacement for Wallace. These party leaders first considered the director of the Office of War Mobilization, James F. Burns of South Carolina, a former senator and Supreme Court justice, before finally settling on Senator Harry Truman of Missouri. In effect, FDR had astutely removed his hand from the process, knowing full well what would happen to Wallace without his active support. Nonetheless, at the 1944 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Wallace showed surprising popularity among the delegates, threatening to ruin the Democratic leadership's carefully orchestrated plan to dump him. After his rousing speech, cheering delegates began to shout for Wallace in 44. The convention chairman, Indiana Senator Samuel D. Jackson, noted that the crowd's enthusiasm and feared that Wallace might win on the first ballot. He therefore called for an adjournment until the next day, blaming fire code infractions due to the more than capacity crowd at the convention center. Although the nays drowned out the ayes on the motion, the chairman declared the session adjourned. During the night, Roosevelt's ambiguous letter of support circulated among the delegates and undermined Wallace's position. The next day, the delegates selected Senator Truman for vice president. Jubilant Democratic leaders later boasted of their role in the affair. Party Chairman Hannigan told friends that his epitaph should read, "Here lies the man who kept Henry Wallace from being President of the United States."
present to this convention for the office of President of these United States one who is endowed with the intellectual boldness of Thomas Jefferson, the indomitable courage of Andrew Jackson, the faith and patience of Abraham Lincoln, the rugged integrity of Grover Cleveland, and the scholarly vision of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
A man who, in writing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "If I were a delegate to this convention, I would vote for Henry A. Wallace." There being 1,176 qualified votes, of which Senator Harry Truman has received more than a majority, I do now declare him to be the nominee of the Democratic Party for Vice President and the next Vice President of the United States.
It's been my privilege to be a United States Senator for the past 9.5 years, and I expect to continue the effort which I've been making in that capacity as a United States Senator to help shorten the war and win the peace under the direction of our great leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And I'm sure some of you are probably thinking to yourselves, well, dead history, TJ, you must have visited Hannigan's gravesite. So what does his epitaph say? Well, actually, I have not visited Hannigan's gravesite. I believe he's in St. Louis, Missouri, I believe. And I do know for a fact, though, that his epitaph and gravestone, and it says nothing of the sort. So obviously that was a joke. We all know that, but somebody didn't actually do that and, write that on his epitaph. So it doesn't say, "Here lies the man who kept Henry Wallace from being president of the United States." It does not say that. So there you go. By 1944, Wallace was an extremely popular political figure in the United States. A July Gallup poll showed that 65% of Democratic voters favored his renomination as vice president. He was viewed by many Americans as the torchbearer of progressive liberal domestic reform and the great champion of cooperation in international affairs. Because of such perceptions, as well as the battles he fought with Jesse Jones while at the helm of the BEW, conservative Democrats were determined by summer of 1944 to force him from the vice presidency, particularly in view of widespread doubt that Roosevelt's health would allow the president to complete a fourth term. Roosevelt's own feelings on retaining Wallace as vice president remained ambiguous throughout the spring and early summer. But by the time of the Democratic convention in mid-July, his actions worked against Wallace's renomination. Earlier in the year, Wallace had proposed to Roosevelt that he make a vice presidential tour of Soviet Asia and China. Wallace expected both to become areas of important social, economic, and political development in the post-war era. Roosevelt readily agreed, perhaps seeing the trip as a way to remove the vice president from the domestic political scene. Thus, from late May through early July, Wallace traveled in Asia while pre-convention political machinations in the United States heated up. He visited mines, farms, and factories in Russia and made speeches that he hoped would establish the foundation for what he termed world security on the basis of broader understanding. In Siberia, Wallace was received warmly with great respect, in part because of his clearly exceptional agricultural knowledge. But he was also welcomed enthusiastically because he had taken the time, characteristically, during the months preceding the trip, to study enough of the Russian language to enable himself to deliver a speech in his host's native tongue. Upon his return to the United States, Wallace recounted the great respect he felt for Soviet accomplishments in Siberia, in notable comparison to the serious doubts and even disdain he felt for the corruption he witnessed under Chiang Kai-shek's regime in China. He was only vaguely aware that much of what he was shown by the Russians, model factories and mining towns peopled by enthusiastic workers, was a false front put up by the Soviets to guarantee his positive report to the U.S. president and people. By the time Wallace returned home, his hold on the vice presidency was quite tenuous. Despite the strong support he had among rank-and-file Democrats, Southern Democratic leaders and party bosses wanted him out. In conversation, the president himself was vaguely contradictory, telling Wallace that if he, Roosevelt, were a delegate to the convention, he would vote for HenryAWallace, but that there were many in the party who felt otherwise. By the time of the convention, Roosevelt's perhaps false ambivalence led him to desert Wallace effectively by indicating that he would be willing to share the ticket with either Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas or Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, both of whom were viewed by party conservatives as acceptably moderate alternatives. Roosevelt was formally renominated on the evening of July 20th, and Wallace made a dramatic speech from the platform seconding the president's nomination. In bold terms, he asserted a powerfully progressive position, including a call for racial equality in education, economics, and politics. He spoke with a candor that probably cost him whatever chance remained for the renomination. This speech was followed by a huge demonstration on Wallace's behalf. Some historians have argued that had the party bosses not succeeded in having the convention adjourned at that moment, Wallace might have been nominated the same evening. In fact, much of the demonstration was made by Wallace supporters in the galleries who were not actual delegates. In any case, the convention was adjourned, and the next day, Wallace was beaten in the balloting by Truman. After his re-election that November, Roosevelt nominated Wallace for Secretary of Commerce, and Wallace's confirmation by the Senate became yet another acrimonious battle over his liberalism. He finally won confirmation, but not before his Senate opponents stripped the position of its traditional control of important federal lending agencies. Nevertheless, Wallace was heading the Department of Commerce when Roosevelt died in April of 1945 and Harry S. Truman became president. Truman kept Wallace in the cabinet, at first believing that he needed Wallace to retain the support of the left wing of the Democratic Party, which continued to view Truman with great skepticism. But by the summer of 1946, Wallace was increasingly in disagreement with Truman over the course of U.S. foreign policy, particularly over U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, the nation's World War II ally. In a letter he wrote to the president in July, Wallace predicted not only the arms race to come, but the sort of international paranoia and tension that would result from such a race. He laid the blame for tensions at the feet of both nations, but suggested that the United States could ease them by slowing down the tremendous expansion of its military establishment that was taking place, especially in atomic weapons and delivery systems. In September, Wallace reiterated many of the same points in a speech he gave at a progressive political rally at Madison Square Garden in New York. This speech engendered great controversy both within the administration and the national press. The positions that Wallace advocated seemed to oppose strongly those being established by Secretary of State James Burns, who was in Paris at the time attending a meeting of foreign ministers. It was ultimately at Burns's irate insistence that Truman demanded Wallace's resignation from the cabinet. Commerce Secretary. Although defeated for renomination, Wallace did not retire from politics. His active campaigning for FDR's fourth term led the president to reward his loyalty with appointment as Secretary of Commerce. Some have suggested that Roosevelt believed the Senate would never confirm Wallace. In his letter firing Jesse Jones as Commerce Secretary, FDR admitted that Wallace's appointment was a repayment for his utmost devotion to our cause. This letter caused a storm of debate in Congress and the press. Members of Congress expressed serious doubt about Wallace's abilities and were particularly disturbed at the prospect that he would take charge of the billions of dollars of loans made by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. As a compromise, senators who wished to let the president have his appointment, yet shuddered at giving their former presiding officer power, voted to transfer the money-lending responsibilities of the RFC out of the Commerce Department's jurisdiction. Stripped of his economic influence, Wallace was confirmed. Wallace's short career directing the Commerce Department was racked with controversy. 82 days after Wallace left office as vice president, Franklin Roosevelt died, making Harry Truman president. Truman's administration took a decidedly hardline turn against the Soviet Union, a policy that, coupled with the increasing influence of conservatives in Truman's cabinet, confounded and alienated Wallace. Expressing his disapproval of Truman's foreign policy, Wallace wrote a 12-page letter urging the United States to exercise caution in abandoning its powerful wartime ally. Wallace firmly believed that the only way to end the spread of communism was to raise the world's standards of living. In a speech at Madison Square Garden in September of 1946, Wallace warned that American foreign policy towards Russia could lead to a third world war. Although Wallace had previously cleared his remarks with Truman, his speech occurred at the very time Secretary of State James Burns was negotiating with Soviet authorities in Paris. Burns charged that Wallace's speech had undermined U.S. policy and suggested damaging disunity within the administration. Shortly thereafter, Truman fired Wallace as Secretary of Commerce. After leaving public office, Wallace became the editor of the New Republic magazine. Through his editorials, he continued to oppose the Truman administration's hard line toward the Russians, as well as what he viewed as the increasingly conservative course of U.S. politics. By late December of 1947, motivated by such issues, he decided to run for the presidency against Truman on the ticket of the resurrected Progressive Party. For Wallace, the campaign of 1948 was a culmination of the various controversies that had followed him throughout his public career. To those of his critics who viewed him as too far to the left, his association with communists in the Progressive Party seemed to prove their greatest fears, and his path-breaking insistence on integrated rallies while campaigning in the South enraged conservative Southern Democrats, even while it foreshadowed aspects of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Wallace's relationship with Nicholas Roerich, particularly its spiritual aspects, became an issue during the campaign of 1948 as well. Their association was brought to light by conservative columnist Westbrook Pegler, who smeared Wallace by publishing and critically interpreting several letters Wallace had written during the 1930s to Roerich and Roerich's secretary on both political and spiritual issues. Pegler harped on aspects of the correspondence in such a way as to make it seem that Wallace had been under the mystical sway of Roerich, with Roerich characterized as Wallace's guru. Wallace's failure to squarely address the Roerich connection, as well as the larger issue of his spiritualistic inclinations, contributed to the further degradation of his reputation in the midst of the disastrous campaign. Throughout the campaign, Wallace was portrayed in the mainstream press as a foolish dupe of the communists. Truman and the anti-communist liberals who eventually came to support him went so far at times as to imply Wallace's disloyalty. The election itself was anticlimactic. The progressives were crushed in the presidential election, with Wallace receiving only 1.1 million votes, less than 2.5% of all those cast. The debacle of the 1948 election was the effective end of Wallace's public career. Although he did speak out on various issues occasionally, over the next decade and a half, he in fact retired to a farm he had purchased in upstate New York, returning to his earliest passion, experimental agricultural genetics. He spent his later years developing various strains of garden flowers, hybrid corn, chickens, and strawberries. In 1964, he was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, and after a year battling the illness, he succumbed to it, dying on November 18th of 1965 at the age of 77. Later years. Wallace's final public action was a failed bid for the presidency in 1948. Still commanding a modest following from left-wing groups, he ran on the progressive ticket, campaigning against Truman, the Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey, and the Dixiecrat candidate Strom Thurmond. Support from the Communist Party damaged Wallace's campaign by alienating many liberals and other voters. The aggressive actions of the Soviets in Berlin and Czechoslovakia also turned voters against Wallace. The former vice president had little impact on the election, except by capturing enough votes in New York to throw that state to Dewey. Rather than present himself as the liberal, internationalist alternative to the Cold Warriors, Wallace had bolted to a third party. This action, combined with the walkout of conservative Southern Democrats over the issue of civil rights, made Truman appear to be the centrist candidate carrying on the traditions of Roosevelt and the New Deal, thus enabling him to win the upset victory of the century. Following his defeat in 1948, Henry Wallace retired from official political life. He still believed in his concept of world peace and worked for social justice in Latin America, traveling there on numerous occasions and persuading foundations to support the region's developing nations. In retirement, Wallace continued his genetic experimentation on various strains of corn and other crops, a scientific inquiry that provided him with the satisfaction his political career had lacked. At the end of his life, as he suffered from Lou Gehrig's disease, Wallace continued to reflect on international issues and worried about the United States' deepening involvement in Vietnam. He traced the origins of that war back to the beginning of the Cold War, when I was getting the hell kicked out of me for suggesting that we were taking on more than we could chew. Wallace died on November 18th of 1965 in Danbury, Connecticut. Henry Wallace will be remembered as an unusual vice president because of the circumstances of his rise and fall from power, and because of his unprecedented executive responsibilities. His foreign travels also forged new political paths that later vice presidents would follow. Clearly, Wallace's personal eccentricities contributed to his political failure in Washington politics. Yet, viewed in retrospect from after the end of the Cold War, his visionary social liberalism, so radically different from the politics of Harry Truman, raises the question of how world events might have been different had the vote for vice president at the 1944 Democratic Convention not been delayed overnight. Wallace initially remained active in politics, of course, as we said, after the 1948 campaign. He delivered the keynote address at the 1950 Progressive National Convention. In early 1949, Wallace testified before Congress in the hope of preventing the ratification of the North Atlantic Treaty, which established a NATO alliance between the U.S., Canada, and several European countries. He became increasingly critical of the Soviet Union after 1948, and he resigned from the Progressive Party in August of 1950 due to his support for the UN intervention in the Korean War. After leaving the Progressive Party, Wallace endured what biographers John Carver and John Hyde describe as a long, slow decline into obscurity marked by a certain acceptance of his outcast status. Early 1950s, he spent much of his time rebuting attacks by prominent public figures like General Leslie Groves, who claimed to have stopped providing Wallace with information regarding the Manhattan Project because he considered Wallace to be a security risk. In 1951, Wallace appeared before Congress to deny accusations that in 1944 he had encouraged a coalition between Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communists. In 1952, he published an article, Where I Was Wrong, in which he repudiated his early foreign policy positions and declared the Soviet Union to be utterly evil. Wallace continued to co-own and take an interest in the company he had established, Pioneer Hybrid, formerly known as the Hybrid Corn Company, and he established an experimental farm at his New York estate. He focused much of his efforts on the study of chickens, and Pioneer Hybrid's chickens at one point constituted 3/4 of all commercially sold eggs worldwide. He also wrote or co-wrote several works on agriculture, including a book on the history of corn. Wallace did not endorse a candidate in the 1952 presidential election, but in the 1956 presidential election, he endorsed incumbent Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower over Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson. Wallace, who maintained a correspondence with Eisenhower, described Eisenhower as utterly sincere in his efforts for peace. Wallace also began a correspondence with Vice President Richard Nixon, but he declined to endorse either Nixon or Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election. Though Wallace criticized Kennedy's farm policy during the 1960 campaign, Kennedy invited Wallace to his 1961 inauguration, the first presidential inauguration Wallace had attended since 1945. Wallace later wrote Kennedy, "At no time in our history have so many tens of millions of people been so completely enthusiastic about an inaugural address as about yours." In 1962, he delivered a speech commemorating the centennial anniversary of the establishment of the Department of Agriculture. He also began a correspondence with President Lyndon B. Johnson regarding methods to alleviate rural poverty. Though privately he criticized Johnson's escalation of American involvement in the Vietnam War. In the 1964 election, Wallace returned to the Democratic fold, supporting Johnson over Republican nominee Barry Goldwater. Due to declining health, he made his last public appearance that year. In one of his last speeches, he stated, "We lost Cuba in 1959, not only because of Castro, but also because we failed to understand the needs of the farmer in the backcountry of Cuba from 1920 onward. The common man is on the march, but it is up to the uncommon men of education and insight to lead that march constructively." Wallace was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, in 1964. He consulted numerous specialists and tried various methods of treating the disease, stating, "I look on myself as an ALS guinea pig, willing to try almost anything." He died in Danbury, Connecticut on November 18th of 1965 at the age of 77. His remains were cremated and the ashes interred in Glendale Cemetery in Des Moines, Iowa. Due to his successful business career and wise investments, he left an estate valued at tens of millions of dollars. I touched on that in 1913, Wallace met Elo Brown, the daughter of a successful businessman from Indianola, Iowa. Wallace and Brown married on May 20th of 1914 and had 3 children, Henry Brown, Robert Brown, and Jean Brown. Wallace and his family lived in Des Moines until Wallace accepted appointment as Secretary of Agriculture, at which point they began living in an apartment at Wardman Park in Washington, D.C. In 1945, Wallace and his wife purchased a 115-acre farm near South Salem, New York, known as Farview. Ilo was supportive of her husband's career and enjoyed serving as Second Lady of the United States. Though she was uncomfortable with many of Wallace's progressive supporters during his 1948 presidential campaign. Wallace and Ilo remained married until his death in 1965. She lived until 1981. In 1999, Wallace's 3 children sold their shares in the Pioneer Hybrid to DuPont for well over $1 billion. Wallace's grandson, Scott Wallace, won the Democratic nomination for Pennsylvania's 1st congressional district in the 2018 elections. Despite his family's legacy, he was defeated by Republican incumbent Brian Fitzpatrick in the general election. Then it kind of touches on his religious explorations and that Nicholas Roerich controversy. After his grandfather's death in 1916, Wallace left the Presbyterian Church and became increasingly interested in mysticism. He later said, "I know I am often called a mystic, and in the years following my leaving the United Presbyterian Church, I was probably a practical mystic. I'd say I was a mystic in the sense that George Washington Carver was, who believed God was in everything, and therefore, if you went to God, you could find the answers." Then it just talks some more about his, religious, kind of just all these different things that he tried, his explorations into different religions. I'm not going to really go too deep into that. I touched on it already. So there you go. I already told you, he also reportedly dabbled in Zorro one. I forgot how to pronounce it. I apologize. And Buddhism. So, he was all worldly when it came to different, religions and such. And then, of course, his legacy. During his time in the Roosevelt administration, Wallace became a controversial figure, attracting a mix of praise and criticism for various actions. And he remains a controversial figure today. Historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. pronounced Wallace to be both an incorrigibly naive politician and the best Secretary of Agriculture the country has ever had. Journalist Peter Baynart writes that Wallace's naive faith in the U.S.-Soviet cooperation damaged his legacy. Historian Andrew Seal lauds Wallace for his focus on combating both economic and racial inequality. Wallace's vision of the century of the common man, which denied him American exceptionalism in foreign policy, continues to influence the foreign policy of individuals like Bernie Sanders. In 2013, historian Thomas W. Devine wrote that newly available Soviet sources do confirm Wallace's position that Moscow's behavior was not as relentlessly aggressive as many believed at the time. Yet Devine also writes that enough new information has come to light to cast serious doubt both on Wallace's benign attitude towards Stalin's intentions and on his dark, conspiratorial view of the Truman administration. Alex Ross of the New Yorker writes, with the exception of Al Gore, Wallace remains the most famous almost president in American history. Journalist Jeff Greenfield writes that the 1944 Democratic National Convention was one of the most important political events of the 20th century, since the leading contenders for the nomination might have governed in vastly different ways. In the Untold History of the United States, Oliver Stone argues that, had Wallace become president in 1945, there might have been no atomic bombings, no nuclear arms race, and no Cold War. By contrast, Ron Capshaw of the conservative National Review argues that a President Wallace would have practiced a policy of appeasement that would have allowed the spread of communism into countries like Iran, Greece, and Italy. The HenryAWallace Beltsville Agricultural Research Center in Beltsville, Maryland, is the largest agricultural research complex in the world, and it is named for him. Wallace founded the Wallace Genetic Foundation to support agricultural research. His son Robert founded the Wallace Global Fund to support sustainable development. A speech Wallace delivered in 1942 inspired Aaron Copland to compose fanfare for the common man. So then, just a couple quick things. I actually found another special guest here.
Hi.
Henry's back. There is a plaque. Well, I shouldn't say it's a plaque. It's a monument to Henry Wallace in Orient, Iowa, where, which is his birthplace town. These couple pictures you're seeing, I did not visit this. I did not visit his birthplace, home or the town. I visited none of that. So these are stock photos that I found. It's a nice plaque, though. Very nice plaque. Or monument, I should say. It's pretty big, it looks like, from the pictures. The interesting thing about this monument, though, is it says something to the effect of, like, his innovative work on the, the production of hybrid corn, or something to that effect. Something about his innovative work on corn. But the monument has no mention, zero mention, about him being vice president of the United States. How crazy is that, right, Henry?
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it talks about corn, but not vice president.
Not vice president.
Nah. Corn, though.
Corn.
Yeah.
Corn.
Corn.
Oh my God.
Definitely corn.
Definitely corn.
So,
Corn.
yeah, don't forget the corn. So, another quick thing I wanted to show you guys. There's some videos. I want to show you a few video clips of our 33rd Vice President, HenryAWallace. So take a look here.
Abundance. The bomb uncontrolled. I've said enough about the peacetime possibilities of atomic energy. It is important that everybody be aware of not only the dangers, but also the advantages which this new atomic era brings. We are headed toward full peacetime interchange of the useful values of atomic energy between scientists of all industries and nations. Thank God the key to the atom is owned by all the people and not by those creatures of special privilege who would hide behind a military or industrial cloak to use this new device to bring the peoples of the world into subjection to atomic imperialism. We who are here tonight know that no organization, however powerful, will ever prevent war if the causes of war are not removed. Therefore, I say that atomic energy constructively applied to raising the standard of living of all peoples will do infinitely more to eliminate war than any type of control over atomic bombs. And so that every nation in its own way and in cooperation with other nations may discover new peacetime uses. No one today can predict with accuracy the possible peacetime uses 1 year, 5 years, or 20 years hence. We do know that within a year, a fairly efficient atomic power could be constructed. We do.
The world's most honored watch is Longines.
Longines watches have won 10 World's Fair grand prizes, 28 gold medals, and more honors for accuracy than any other timepiece. Longines, the world's most honored watch, is made and guaranteed by the Longines Whitnall Watch Company.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour, brought to you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. A presentation of the Longines Whitnall Watch Company, maker of Longines, the world's most honored watch, and Whitnall, distinguished companion to the world-honored Longines.
Good evening. This is Frank Knight. May I introduce our co-editors for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope? Colonel Ansel Talbot, one of the editors of the New York Herald Tribune, and Mr. William Bradford Huey, editor of the American Mercury. Our distinguished guest for this evening is Mr. HenryAWallace, former Vice President of the United States. The opinions expressed are necessarily those of the speakers.
Mr. Wallace, you, of course, are one of the most controversial political figures of our time. And I believe one of the most controversial points that you've ever advocated was American spending, large-scale American spending abroad. Now, when did you begin advocating this program, sir?
Sometime in 1941, and in a rather extensive way in 1942.
And you were a real pioneer in that field. You were one of the first Americans to so advocate that spending, weren't you?
I was so recognized at that time.
And you were bitterly assailed. I believe that was referred to as globaloney and as the building of TVAs on the Danube and other such...
Milk for Hottentots and so forth. I'm very proud of the names that were called at that time because those names caused the people really to remember that I stood for what is now looked on increasingly as a very enlightened program.
Well, now, it's been 10 years now since you began that advocacy, sir. And tonight I'm sure that our chronoscope audience would like to know exactly what you think now about that program. And specifically, what do you regard as the most critical areas in the world today?
Well, today the most critical areas, in my opinion, comprise the Mohammedan world extending from French Morocco on the west all the way across to the southern part of the Philippines, and including also the Hindu world. And in addition, I would say South Korea, because it seems to me of absolutely vital importance if we wish to gain the sympathy of the peoples of Asia and the Near East, that we do a real job for the South Koreans as soon as the war comes to an end. If we don't do that real job to rehabilitate them, we will lose face even more decisively than we would lose if we lost the war.
So there you go, some video clips and that sort of thing of HenryAWallace. I know this part 2 is running pretty long. I have a feeling, guys, that this is going to be kind of the way it is for the remaining vice presidents. As everyone knows, the early on guys, from the late 1700s throughout the 1800s, there's information about them out there, but not nearly the amount of information that there is with the 20th century and beyond vice presidents. So, plus the invention of the motion picture, the video, that is obviously going to add to some time during these videos. So just keep that in mind, that these vice president videos, when you total them up, they're going to be well over 2 hours probably moving forward between part 1 and part 2. So just so everyone knows. Right, Henry?
Yep.
Got to cover it all, right?
Cover it all.
So last thing I want to show you guys, I talked about this in part 1, was about the relationship between HenryAWallace and George Washington Carver. And there's actually a monument built commemorating the story of HenryAWallace and George Washington Carver. Pretty cool. About 120 years ago, what was then the far western edge of Des Moines, Iowa, lived a bright teen named HenryAWallace. Given the use of 5 acres of his family's land, he planted corn for use in experiments that, drawing on lessons in plant genetics, he learned from none other than George Washington Carver. It launched him on the path to devising hybridized strains of corn, the cornerstone of Iowa row crop agriculture today. So goes the story told on a historic marker at the corner of 38th Street and Cottage Grove Avenue, where Grace United Methodist Church now stands on the site of the Wallace home. The plaque depicts a rapt Henry listening as Carver instructs him in a field of tall grass. It's pretty cool. I thought it was pretty cool, at least. What do you think, Henry?
Yeah,
So you're seeing pictures of the marker and all that stuff. Supposedly, yeah, they were, they knew each other in their youth, or at least in HenryAWallace's youth. And as the story goes, the Wallaces moved in 1899 to Des Moines, Iowa, where Henry's father and grandfather also named what? Henry. Achieved great success publishing Wallace's Farmer. And then in the early 1900s, when Henry was a student at Des Moines West High School, he got his family's consent to plant 5 acres of corn on land that was on or near the site of the present-day church. That's where the facts veer from the plaque's account. So the plaque is a little bit differing. According to the authoritative biography, American Dreamer, A Life of HenryAWallace, Henry wasn't conducting genetic experiments. He was trying to disprove a popular contention that the best shaped, most visually appealing ears of corn had the best yields. So I guess there's conflicting stories that claim that Henry had learned plant genetics from Carver in the early 1890s strains credibility, given that the science was in its early stages then, and that no matter how brilliant, a kindergartner at the time was unlikely to grasp the complexities of it. Henry himself would later relate in an address that Carver had awakened his interest in plants by teaching him to recognize different species and praising him for having a good eye. So Carver and HenryAWallace definitely knew each other, and Carver definitely taught Wallace some things about plant life and such. But I guess this monument and plaque that's there now commemorating their friendship is a little misconstrued. It's really not as accurate as you would hope for an historical marker. Right, Henry? I mean, especially in this day and age, right?
Yeah.
You would think we could get things right by now. But, yeah, everything. People make mistakes. Historians make mistakes. Researchers make mistakes. It happens. So let's see what else I got here regarding this. I think that's pretty much it. But here we go. So last sentence of this little article I was reading. But there is no exaggerating the fascination of the story of the two very different people, both bound for greatness, who found their common humanity in a fascination with plants. Pretty cool, right? Yeah. So yeah, George Washington Carver and Henry Wallace. Try to read more about it. Hope you enjoyed the pictures I was showing on the screen of the monument and the marker commemorating their friendship. No, I have not visited that. Those are all stock photos I found online. Never have seen that marker. I think it's fairly new, actually. So that's it, right, Henry?
That's it.
I think that's it. The life. Wait, no. I mean, who are we? What's our YouTube name? Dead History. What do we got to talk about? It's Gravesite. I mean, what are we doing here, right? You were about to wrap it all up. So yes, his gravesite, HenryAWallace's gravesite, in the Glendale Cemetery in Des Moines, Iowa. And as you guys just learned, a few minutes ago, he was actually cremated. He was cremated, but his ashes are interred here at this family plot in Glendale Cemetery in Des Moines. And let me tell you something. This is one of the most basic, very, very modest grave sites you will ever see for any sort of president, vice president, anything. As you can see from the couple of pictures I'm showing you, it's pretty basic. I mean, it's just a, bigger stone that says Wallace for the family plot, and then a very small marker that, says HenryAWallace, and does it say Henry A? I believe it does. Yeah, HenryAWallace. It says, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Vice President, and then U.S. Secretary of Commerce. But it is really, really, really underwhelming, truly and honestly. So, but there you go. That's the modest gravesite there in Des Moines, Iowa, of the farm boy, HenryAWallace, our 33rd Vice President. So now stay tuned. Bonus footage, all of my photos, which there's only a handful to be honest. I think I only took 5 or 6 of my visit to his gravesite. So you'll see all my photos in the bonus footage. And now I think we are really done, right, Henry?
Yeah, I think we are done.
I think we are. So thank you guys so much. I'm starting to lose my voice. My voice is cracking.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for all the support. Thank you for all the subscribes, everything, comments and questions. We love it, right?
Love it, yes.
Keep it all coming. So thank you so much for all you guys do. And we will see you, of course, next week for our next Vice Presidential Series installment. And we're going to be taking a look at not technically the 34th Vice President of the United States, because that's actually Harry S. Truman. He became president, so we don't do him, right, Henry?
No, we do not do Harry S. Truman.
Yeah. So we're going to be taking a look actually at the 35th Vice President, Alben Barkley. So there you go, Alben Barkley. So we will see you next week for Barkley. And yeah, we're looking forward to it, right, Henry?
Yep.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
See you next week. Bye-bye. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here, of course, with Dead History. Usually I don't add too much audio ever while I show my photos of the gravesite during bonus footage. However, I just wanted to touch on the more I learned about HenryAWallace, the more I realized that this man really was way ahead of his time. He's possibly the smartest, most intelligent Secretary of Agriculture the United States has ever had and ever seen. He was just he was very progressive, very forward-thinking. You got to remember, this guy, HenryAWallace, he was calling for universal health care. He wanted to end the Cold War. He wanted to end segregation and imperialism. Just way, way ahead of his time. And he was asking for these things and calling for these things way before anyone else was. He was on board with this stuff long before anyone else. When he did run for president, of course, in 1948, he did run on a platform of a very humble foreign policy. When he did run, many people, historians and other people would probably consider him a socialist. He probably was a socialist, but if you kind of put aside his economic kind of way of thinking, because that definitely, it was his economic way of thinking that was more socialist than anything else, of course. So if you put that aside, the man was he was pretty interesting. I've read a lot now, obviously, when I do the research for all these vice presidents. I read a lot of different accounts from historians and people. And, to me, the guy was a visionary. He was a forward-thinking visionary. But a lot of historians consider this guy like naive, kind of wacky and weird and just off his rocker, so to speak. And he probably was a little bit. He probably was a little weird and naive and a little wacky, but he definitely was an interesting man, and probably one of the better vice presidents we've ever had. I'm not saying he's the best. He's not my favorite, but he's definitely probably one of the better vice presidents we've ever had, in my opinion, after what I've learned of him. So I just wanted to add that in because I thought it was interesting learning all this about HenryAWallace. So I hope you enjoyed it. Very curious to see what your opinion of Wallace is now that you learned a little more about him. Leave your comments below. Tell me what you think of HenryAWallace. Was he good? Was he bad? Was he crazy? Let me know. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks, guys. See you next week.